Back on Earth, the leadership gathered again, and this time the mood was different because everyone understood that humanity was completely alone, and that the Council would not help and would probably interfere if humans tried to operate in their space. President Turner looked tired and older than he had just months before, and General Montgomery had dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights, planning for scenarios that seemed impossible to survive. Daniel reported everything that had happened at the Council, and the dismissive response they had received, and the evidence that some species were secretly evacuating while publicly denying the threat existed. Helen Martinez added that her monitoring systems showed the entity had accelerated its consumption rate and was now taking multiple systems per day instead of per week. Nathan Cross had been working on theoretical models, and he presented his findings, with the warning that much of it was speculation based on incomplete data. He explained that the entity seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in higher dimensions, which was how it could move without propulsion and consume matter so completely. If they could map its dimensional signature, they might be able to disrupt its ability to phase between dimensions. President Turner asked how long developing such a weapon would take, and Nathan admitted that with Council resources and cooperation, it would take years, and with only human resources, it might take decades. They did not have decades or even years, because Nathan's projections showed the entity would reach Earth's solar system in less than 12 months. General Montgomery proposed an alternative, which was to build weapons based on what they did understand, even if those weapons were crude and untested. The concept was simple in theory, which was to create artificial gravity wells strong enough to trap the entity in normal space long enough to damage it physically. Nathan looked skeptical, but admitted it might work if they could generate enough gravitational force. The project was given the code name Prometheus Protocol, and every industrial facility on Earth and Mars and the orbital stations was converted to support it. Resources that had been allocated to expansion and exploration were redirected, and for the first time since achieving spaceflight, humanity pulled back and focused entirely on survival. Karen Walsh continued studying the entity using every scrap of data they could gather from remote sensors and abandoned Council monitoring stations. She made a discovery that changed everything, which was that the entity was not just consuming matter, but was also absorbing information and knowledge. Every civilization it encountered added to its understanding, and it was learning from each conquest and becoming more efficient. She presented this finding at a strategy meeting, and explained that the entity had started as something relatively simple, based on analysis of its early attack patterns, but with each system it consumed, it gained the collective knowledge of that civilization. Now it understood advanced physics and biology and military tactics because it had absorbed hundreds of species who had mastered those fields. Admiral Hayes asked if that meant the entity was intelligent, and Karen said it was more accurate to say it was becoming intelligent, and that it might now be aware that humanity was specifically trying to fight back. Eric Chen supported this by showing that recent energy signatures suggested the entity had changed its approach vector and was now heading toward Earth more directly than the spreading pattern would suggest. The entity knew humanity was a threat, and it was curious about the species that had dared to resist, and this was both terrifying and potentially useful. If the entity was curious, it might be predictable, and if it was predictable, they could lay a trap. Work on the Prometheus devices continued at a desperate pace, and teams worked around the clock to build the massive gravity generators that would form the core of each device. The physics were theoretical, and the engineering was pushing human capabilities to their absolute limits, but somehow the devices took shape. Linda Parker was assigned to test security protocols for the deployment, and she worked with her Marines to develop tactics for protecting the devices during activation. She knew it was probably pointless because if the entity reached the devices before detonation, nothing they could do would stop it, but having a plan made everyone feel slightly less helpless. Meanwhile, Daniel and Amy and Kyle had not been idle, and they had begun reaching out to independent ships and stations that operated outside Council authority. These were rogues and exiles and survivors from systems that had already fallen, and while they had no love for humanity, they also had nothing left to lose. Some responded with interest, and others ignored the messages, but slowly, a network began to form of ships and crews who were willing to consider cooperation. Daniel was honest with them and explained that humanity had no miracle solution, and that fighting the entity might accomplish nothing except dying with dignity rather than waiting helplessly for the end. More ships responded to that honesty than had responded to any diplomatic overture, and Amy noted that species who had been through trauma seemed to recognize that humanity was speaking from genuine desperation rather than political maneuvering. Kyle added that desperation made for strange alliances, and that some of the species agreeing to help had been openly hostile to humanity just a year before. 6 months after the Council rejected humanity's warning, the entity reached the core territories, and 5 major civilizations fell in a single week. The Council finally acknowledged the crisis publicly, but their response was fractured and ineffective because each species only cared about protecting their own worlds, and none would share resources or coordinate strategy. Helen watched the Council, channels, and saw species that had called humanity primitive, now begging for help from anyone who would listen, and she felt no satisfaction in being proven right. President Turner asked if they should offer assistance, and Helen said that humanity barely had enough resources to defend their own system, and spreading themselves thinner would just mean everyone died instead of possibly some surviving. It was a cold calculation, but it was also realistic, and everyone in the room knew it, even if saying it out loud felt like abandoning basic decency. General Montgomery pointed out that some council species had refused to evacuate their populations because they still believed the threat would somehow resolve itself, and those people were beyond saving. The Prometheus devices were completed ahead of schedule because failure was not an option, and they were loaded onto transport ships for deployment in the outer solar system. The plan was to create a defensive perimeter near Neptune, where the entity could be engaged before it reached the inner planets where Earth and Mars held billions of people who had nowhere to evacuate. Admiral Hayes assembled his fleet, which now numbered 70 ships, including some independent vessels that had joined humanity's cause. It was not impressive compared to Council armadas, but it represented everything humanity could field, and everyone involved knew this was likely a one-way mission. Karen and Peter and Eric were aboard the Horizon, analyzing final data and making last-minute adjustments to the Prometheus protocols. Karen had developed a theory about how to maximize damage to the entity, which involved synchronizing the detonations to create resonance effects in the dimensional boundaries, but the math was complex, and she could not guarantee it would work. Peter ran simulations and concluded that Karen's approach had a 30% chance of success, compared to 10% for conventional deployment, and Admiral Hayes said those were the best odds anyone had offered, so they would go with Karen's plan. Eric worked on the timing sequences because synchronization would need to be precise down to microseconds. Linda and her Marines prepared for deployment, and she gave a speech to her troops that was short and honest, and she said they were probably going to die, but they would make it count. Her troops responded with determination rather than fear, because they had all volunteered knowing the odds, and they trusted Linda to lead them well, even if leading them well meant leading them to death. The entity was detected entering the solar system 3 weeks ahead of projections, and it had grown even larger than satellite imagery suggested. It came through the outer debris fields, consuming asteroids and small moons as it advanced, and its approach was deliberate and focused directly on Earth, as if it could sense the concentration of human life and technology. Admiral Hayes gave the order to engage, and the fleet moved to intercept positions, and the Prometheus devices were deployed in a carefully calculated pattern that would funnel the entity through the maximum number of gravity wells. Every ship was in position, and every weapon was armed, and everyone waited for the entity to close the distance. Karen watched her instruments and saw the entity's dimensional signature becoming clearer as it approached, and she realized with horror that it had adapted again, and its structure was more stable than previous scans had shown. She reported this to Admiral Hayes and recommended increasing the Prometheus yield, but he said they were already at maximum, and there was nothing more they could do except hope it was enough. Daniel Harper had been preparing for this moment for 3 years, and now, as he stood in the massive chamber of the Galactic Council, he felt smaller than he had ever felt in his entire life. The room stretched upward into darkness, and all around him were aliens from worlds he could barely pronounce, and they sat in their elevated seats looking down at the humans who had come to ask for acceptance into their grand civilization. Amy Richardson stood beside Daniel, and she was supposed to be the one who understood alien cultures, but even she seemed overwhelmed by the sheer number of species present, and on Daniel's other side was Kyle Matthews, who kept his military bearing, even though his hand occasionally moved toward where his sidearm would have been if weapons had been allowed in this place. The Zarathi Prime Minister began speaking, and her voice came through the translator as cold and final, and she said that humanity had been evaluated according to the standards that had been used for thousands of years, and the verdict was clear and without any room for debate. Humanity was primitive, and their technology was barely adequate for travel within their own star system, and their culture was violent and divided, and their military capability was laughable compared to even the smallest council member species. Daniel tried to speak, but his microphone cut off before he could say a single word, and the Prime Minister continued saying that humanity would be confined to their home system and that they could reapply for council membership in 500 years if they managed to survive that long and improve themselves to acceptable standards. The other delegates had already stopped paying attention, and conversations in 100 different languages filled the chamber. And Daniel looked at Amy and saw tears forming in her eyes, though she was too proud to let them fall. And Kyle was gripping the podium so hard that his knuckles had turned white. They had spent so much time preparing for this, and Earth had united for the first time in its entire history, just to make this petition possible, and now they were being dismissed like children who had wandered into an adult conversation, and nobody even cared enough to be polite about it. The walk back to their ship was silent, and their escort was a young Vraxian officer who seemed embarrassed by the whole situation, and kept looking away whenever Daniel tried to make eye contact. The diplomatic vessel was small by council standards, but it had been the pride of Earth's fleet when it launched, and now it felt like a toy compared to the massive ships docked around them. Inside the ship, Daniel finally allowed himself to sit down, and Amy poured drinks for all three of them even though it was barely noon by ship time, and Kyle accepted his without comment. They sat in silence for a long time before Amy spoke and said that maybe in 500 years humanity would be different enough to meet their standards, and her voice made it clear she did not believe her own words. Kyle laughed, but it was not a happy sound, and he said that 500 years was nothing to species that lived for millennia, but for humanity, it might as well be forever. And Daniel agreed and added that by the time 500 years passed, the people of Earth would have forgotten this humiliation and would probably not even bother applying again. Meanwhile, on the edge of council space, a small survey ship called Pathfinder was doing routine scans of empty regions that no one else cared about, and Lieutenant Carla Jensen was on duty when her instruments picked up something strange. The readings made no sense according to any database she could access, and the energy signature was coming from the void between galaxies where nothing should exist at all. Carla flagged the readings and sent them to her captain, who was a man named Victor Stone. And Victor looked at the data and frowned because he had been surveying space for 20 years and had never seen anything like this. He told Carla to keep monitoring and to compile a full report, because this was exactly the kind of discovery that could make careers and put humanity on the map as a legitimate scientific presence. But when Victor tried to send the report to council science authorities, his messages bounced back with error codes, and when he checked the diplomatic channels, he found that humanity's access had been revoked and their petition had been denied. The news hit the crew hard because they had all been hoping that council membership would mean better equipment and support for their research, and now they were back to being alone in an indifferent universe. Victor decided to send the report to Earth instead, and maybe someone there would know what to do with it, but communication across those distances took time, and by the time anyone received the message, weeks would have passed. Carla continued monitoring the strange readings, and over the next few days they grew stronger and more complex, and she started to think that maybe this was not just an energy signature, but something that had purpose and intent behind it. She mentioned this to Victor, and he told her not to jump to conclusions, but she could see in his eyes that he was thinking the same thing. 3 weeks after the council rejected humanity's petition, something happened that would change everything, though nobody knew it yet. The Valorian system had been broadcasting signals for thousands of years, and their civilization was old and proud, and they had 12 planets full of billions of people who had never known war or hunger or fear. Then one morning every single signal from Valoria stopped, and the silence was so sudden and complete that at first the council monitoring stations thought it was an equipment malfunction. They ran diagnostics and everything checked out fine, and They tried to hail Valoria on every frequency and got nothing back but empty static. Ships were dispatched to investigate, and they arrived expecting to find some technical problem, or perhaps a solar flare that had disrupted communications. But what they found instead was impossible to comprehend. The star was still burning, and the planets were still there, and all the cities and buildings and ships were intact, but there was not a single living thing anywhere in the entire system. The investigation teams walked through empty streets where lights still shone and machines still ran, and meals sat half-eaten on tables as if everyone had simply vanished in an instant. There was no sign of struggle or panic or any indication of what had happened, and that somehow made it worse than if they had found bodies or destruction. The council called an emergency session, and theories flew back and forth about plagues and weapons and dimensional rifts, but nobody could agree on anything, and while they argued, 3 more systems went silent in the same inexplicable way, and then 7 more, and then 20. On Earth, Director Helen Martinez sat in her office watching the reports come in through unofficial channels that humanity had set up before their expulsion, and she felt a cold dread settling into her bones, because she could see the pattern even if the council could not or would not. The silence was spreading outward from the galactic edge, and it was moving faster with each passing week. She called for an emergency meeting with Earth's leadership, and President Jacob Turner arrived with General Lisa Montgomery and Chief Scientist. Nathan Cross and Helen showed them everything she had gathered. The map of silent systems formed a growing wave that was sweeping through council space, and Nathan calculated that at the current rate it would reach human territory in 18 months or less. President Turner asked what the council was doing about it, and Helen said they were still arguing about jurisdiction and protocol, and none of them seemed willing to accept that something unprecedented was happening. General Montgomery said that if the council would not act, then humanity needed to start preparing, and everyone in the room knew she was right, even though they had no idea what they were preparing for. The council continued to debate while more systems fell silent and the pattern became impossible to ignore, though many still tried and the various species pointed fingers at each other, while refusing to share resources or coordinate any meaningful response. Each civilization seemed to think they could protect their own territory if they just built enough defenses or withdrew far enough from the spreading silence, but the numbers told a different story. Helen Martinez had access to monitoring systems that humanity had quietly installed throughout council space back when they were still trying to be diplomatic, and these systems continued sending data even after humanity's expulsion. What that data showed was terrifying because the silence was not moving randomly, but following a deliberate path, and it seemed to seek out the most populated systems first, as if whatever was causing it could sense where life was concentrated. Admiral Gregory Hayes was called out of retirement to lead humanity's response, and he was a man who had served in 3 different space conflicts back when Earth was still divided into nations. He looked at the data Helen provided and immediately understood what most council species refused to accept, which was that this was not a natural phenomenon or an accident, but something that hunted with purpose and intelligence. Gregory assembled a fleet of survey ships and research vessels, and while it was not impressive by council standards, it represented a significant portion of humanity's space-capable military. He appointed Dr. Karen Walsh as chief scientist because she had spent years studying alien biology and had published papers that the council had ignored but which showed deep understanding of how different life forms functioned. Karen brought along Dr. Peter Lawson, who specialized in physics that most people found incomprehensible, and a systems analyst named Eric Chen, who could find patterns in data that looked like random noise to everyone else. Together they began analyzing everything that humanity had collected about the silent systems, and they started with the readings that Carla Jensen had detected weeks before anyone else noticed something was wrong. Peter pulled up the data and spent 3 days running it through every analysis program he could access, and when he finally called a meeting aboard the flagship Horizon, his hands were shaking. He displayed the energy signatures for everyone to see and explained that these were not natural emissions from stars or cosmic events, but artificial signals that showed layered complexity and mathematical precision. Eric took over and showed how the signals pulsed in patterns that resembled sonar used by submarines back on Earth, and he said this was not communication between entities, but rather a single entity scanning the galaxy and mapping where biological life existed in the highest concentrations. Karen listened to this and felt her blood run cold because she understood the implication, which was that something was hunting and treating entire civilizations as prey. Admiral Hayes authorized an expedition to a system that had gone silent just days before, and he sent a team including Karen and Peter and Eric, along with a Marine security detail commanded by Sergeant Linda Parker. Linda was a veteran who had seen combat on 3 different moons, and she did not scare easily. But even she felt uneasy as their ship approached the dead system. They landed on the largest planet, which had been home to 15 billion people, according to the last census, and the city stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The buildings stood intact and the power system still functioned, and traffic lights changed colors for vehicles that would never come. But there was not a single living thing anywhere. Karen led the team through empty streets, and they found homes where dinners had been prepared and never eaten, and offices where work had been abandoned mid-task, and hospitals where medical equipment still monitored patients who were no longer there. Everything organic was gone, including the bacteria that should have been breaking down food and waste, which meant whatever took everything had been thorough beyond comprehension. Then Linda found the markings, and she called everyone over to see. Symbols etched into every surface, including walls and floors and ceilings. The symbol was always the same, which was a spiral with lines radiating outward like a dark sun, and it appeared thousands of times throughout the city. Peter scanned the markings and determined they had been burned into the material at the molecular level using energy signatures that matched the readings from Carla's initial detection. Karen stood looking at one of the symbols and said quietly that this was a signature like an artist signing their work, and whatever had taken everything from this world wanted observers to know it had been here. The thought made everyone uncomfortable, because it implied a level of intelligence and perhaps even pride or satisfaction in what had been done. They collected samples and took readings and prepared to leave, but as their ship lifted off, the sensors detected something massive moving through the outer asteroid belt. Eric pulled up the visual feed and everyone gathered around the screen to watch, and what they saw would haunt their dreams for months to come. The entity was enormous, spanning several kilometers in length, and its body appeared to be made of darkness that had somehow gained physical form, and it moved through space without any visible propulsion system. As they watched, it approached an asteroid, and when it touched the rock, the asteroid simply ceased to exist, and the entity grew slightly larger, as if it had converted the matter directly into more of itself. Peter recorded everything and ran the data through analysis programs and discovered that the entity was bending space around itself in ways that should have been impossible according to known physics. It was not just consuming matter, but consuming the information contained within that matter, including the quantum states of every particle. And this was how it could take organic life without leaving any trace. The ship returned to the horizon, and Admiral Hayes called an emergency briefing, and the footage was shown to every captain and officer in the fleet. The silence in the room after the video ended was profound, and finally someone asked the question everyone was thinking, which was whether this thing could be killed. Karen said that anything that existed in physical space had vulnerabilities, and anything that followed rules could be understood, even if those rules were beyond current human knowledge. Peter agreed, and added that the entity was growing with each system it consumed, which meant it had not always been this large, and if it could grow, then it could potentially be diminished or destroyed. Admiral Hayes made a decision and said that humanity needed to warn the Council whether they wanted to listen or not, because this threat was beyond politics or pride. Daniel Harper was contacted and asked if he would be willing to return to the Council chambers and face another humiliation for the sake of getting this information to those who needed it. Daniel agreed without hesitation because he understood that this was bigger than humanity's wounded pride, and Amy and Kyle volunteered to accompany him again. They took all the data and compiled it into a presentation that even the most arrogant council member could not ignore, and they traveled back to that massive chamber where they had been rejected. This time Daniel did not wait for permission, and he activated a broadcast override that humanity's engineers had hidden in their diplomatic equipment specifically for emergencies. His voice echoed through the council chamber, and security moved to stop him, but he spoke quickly and showed the footage of the entity and explained that this was not speculation or theory, but documented fact. The council members watched the presentation, and some looked genuinely disturbed, but others seemed angry that humanity had dared to return uninvited. When Daniel finished the quarian, Ambassador stood and her 4 eyes narrowed with contempt, and she said that humanity was clearly trying to elevate itself through fear tactics, and that this evidence was probably fabricated. The Vraxian prelate agreed and said that humanity's primitive understanding of science meant they were misinterpreting natural phenomena and seeing threats where none existed. Other delegates joined in, and the chamber filled with voices dismissing the warning, and some even suggested that humanity had somehow caused the silent systems as part of an elaborate scheme. Security forces moved in with weapons drawn this time, and Daniel and his team were physically removed from the chamber, and their diplomatic credentials were permanently revoked. As they were dragged out, Kyle noticed something that confirmed his worst suspicions, which was that several council species had already begun quietly evacuating their border systems closest to the spreading silence. They knew the threat was real, but admitting it publicly would mean acknowledging that they were terrified and that they had no solution, and so they chose to maintain their facade of superiority, even as their people died. Kyle mentioned this to Daniel and Amy on the flight back, and they all agreed that the council's pride would be the death of everyone, including themselves. The entity emerged fully into the solar system, and the sight of it made even experienced officers pause because no recording or description had captured the wrongness of seeing it in person. It was darkness given form, and it moved through space, like a predator that had never known failure, and its very presence seemed to make reality bend and twist around it. Human ships opened fire with everything they had, and kinetic rounds and missiles and experimental energy weapons all converged on the entity, but the attacks passed through it or were absorbed without any visible effect. Some weapons seemed to damage it briefly, causing its form to flicker, but then it would stabilize and continue advancing as if nothing had happened. Admiral Hayes watched the tactical display and saw his fleet's weapons having almost no impact, and he knew the Prometheus devices were their only real hope. He ordered the fleet to scatter according to plan, and each ship group moved to draw the entity through the deployment zone where the gravity generators waited silent and primed. Linda Parker was aboard the destroyer Valiant, which was part of the forward group assigned to get dangerously close to the entity to ensure it followed them. Her ship closed to within 5 kilometers, and she looked out the viewport at the thing. They were fighting, and it was worse than any nightmare she had experienced. The entity was not just large, but seemed to extend into dimensions her eyes could not quite process, and looking at it too long made her head hurt. The Valiant fired its remaining weapons at point-blank range and then turned and accelerated away, as the entity pursued, and Linda reported their status to the horizon, saying they had successfully gotten its attention. Other ships in her group were doing the same, and together they led the entity into the kill zone like hunters luring a predator into a trap. Eric Chen watched his countdown timer, and the synchronization had to be perfect, because even a microsecond of error could reduce the effectiveness of Karen's resonance approach. He called out time marks to Admiral Hayes, who relayed them to all ships, telling them to clear the detonation zone and get to minimum safe distance. Some ships were not going to make it out in time, and everyone knew it, but those crews had volunteered for the forward positions knowing the risks. Linda's group was right on the edge of the safe zone, and she pushed her engines to maximum while the entity closed the distance behind them, and she could see on sensors that 2 other destroyers were not going to clear the zone. The commanders of those ships, Captain Roger Blake and Captain Susan Miller, both reported they were too far inside the blast radius, and Admiral Hayes ordered them to eject their crews in escape pods. But both captains refused, saying the pods would not make it either, and they wanted to see if this worked. Their voices were calm and professional, and Linda felt her throat tighten because she had served with both of them. Eric called the final countdown, and at 0, Admiral Hayes gave the order to activate Prometheus Protocol, and all 36 gravity generators detonated simultaneously. The effect was immediate and catastrophic as artificial gravity wells formed and overlapped, creating a web of distorted space-time that trapped the entity like an insect in amber. The entity convulsed, and its form began to destabilize as it was, pulled in multiple directions by forces it could not phase through or absorb. Pieces of it fragmented and dissipated into higher dimensions, and for the first time since this fight began, it appeared to be taking real damage. Karen watched her instruments and saw the dimensional signature breaking down, and she allowed herself to hope that maybe they had found a way to hurt this thing. Peter was recording everything because even if they all died, this data needed to survive so others could learn from it and build on what humanity had discovered. Then the entity adapted, and everyone watching saw it happen in real time as it restructured itself and learned from the attack. It began absorbing the Prometheus energy and converting it into fuel for its own growth, and the gravity wells that should have torn it apart instead made it stronger. Someone on the command channel said it was not working, and their voice carried the weight of despair that everyone felt. But Nathan Cross was actually laughing from his station on Earth where he was monitoring everything, and his voice came through the channel saying, yes, it is working, because the entity restructuring itself meant it had limits and rules, and anything with rules could be understood and beaten. Admiral Hayes understood what Nathan meant, which was that they had just learned the entity could be forced to adapt, and that adaptation took time and energy. If they could force it to adapt repeatedly, they might be able to exhaust it or find a vulnerability during the transition. He ordered all ships to begin pattern attack using every weapon they had, while the entity was still recovering from the Prometheus detonation. The fleet concentrated fire, and this time the weapons had more effect, because the entity's defenses were weakened by its forced adaptation. Explosions rippled across its surface, and sections of it broke away and dissolved, and for several minutes it seemed like humanity might actually win this fight. But the entity was learning faster than they could damage it, and soon it had adapted to their weapons as well, and its form stabilized into something more resilient than before. It began moving again, heading toward the inner system and Earth itself, and there was nothing left that could stop it. Admiral Hayes knew they had one option remaining, which was to ram it with their ships and hope that concentrated physical impact would cause damage. He gave the order, and half the fleet volunteered immediately, including the Valiant, where Linda listened to her captain accept the ramming assignment. Before the order could be executed, something unexpected happened, which was that new ships began emerging from jump points at the edge of the system. At first, everyone thought it was the Council finally responding, but the signatures were wrong, and these were independent vessels and exile ships and survivors from fallen civilizations. Leading them was a Xerathi science vessel commanded by Dr. Colonel, who had been present when the Council rejected humanity. Her voice came through on open channels saying that humanity had been right and the Council had been wrong, and she had brought everyone she could convince to come and fight. There were not many ships, perhaps 20 in total, and most were damaged or outdated, but they represented something more important than firepower, which was validation that humanity had been right to resist. Daniel Harper was aboard one of the independent ships, having insisted on joining the fight, and he opened a channel to Admiral Hayes, offering whatever help his small vessel could provide. Admiral Hayes reorganized his fleet to incorporate the newcomers, and Karen shared all the data about the entity's weaknesses and adaptation patterns. Dr. Colonel reviewed the information and contributed her own analysis based on Xerathi physics, which approached dimensional theory differently than human science. Together, they developed a new approach, which was to use smaller sequential attacks to force the entity to adapt continuously and prevent it from settling into a stable form. The theory was that constant adaptation would drain its energy reserves faster than it could replenish them by consuming matter. The combined fleet implemented this strategy, and the battle became a grinding endurance test where human and alien ships worked together to maintain constant pressure on the entity. Every time it adapted to one attack pattern, they switched to another, and every time it tried to consume asteroids to replenish itself, they drove it away from matter sources. Hours turned into days, and the entity began showing signs of strain as its form became less stable and its movements less coordinated. Karen noticed that its dimensional signature was fluctuating more wildly, and she theorized it was running low on the energy needed to maintain its exotic physics. But humanity was running low on everything as well, and ships were damaged and supplies were depleted, and crew were exhausted beyond anything they had trained for. Linda's destroyer had taken multiple hits and half her systems were offline, and she had lost crew members to decompression when the entity's tendrils had torn through the hull. President Turner watched from Earth as the battle continued, and he knew that even if they won here, the entity might just retreat and return stronger later. Helen Martinez agreed and said they needed a way to finish this permanently, but nobody knew how to kill something that could exist across dimensions and learn from every attack. Nathan had an idea that was desperate even by their current standards, which was to use Earth's sun as a weapon. If they could lure the entity into the sun's corona, the intense gravity and radiation might trap it long enough to be consumed by fusion reactions that it could not adapt to quickly enough. The problem was that getting the entity that close to Earth meant risking everything, and if the plan failed, the entity would have direct access to billions of people. General Montgomery said it was too dangerous, but President Turner overruled her, saying that humanity was going to die anyway, if they did not take risks. Admiral Hayes received the new orders, and he understood what was being asked, which was to lead the entity on a chase through the inner system using Earth itself as bait. He consulted with his captains and with Dr. Colonel and the other alien commanders, and they all agreed it was insane, but also their best remaining option. The fleet began a fighting retreat toward the sun, and they used every trick. The chase brought them past Mars, where orbital defense stations added their fire to slow the entity and buy time for the evacuation transports that were moving people to underground shelters. Linda watched from the Valiant as her homeworld fell behind and wondered if she would ever see it again and whether there would be anyone left alive to remember this battle. They passed Earth at a distance that made everyone nervous, and the entity tried to break away toward the planet, but the fleet concentrated fire and drew its attention back. Daniel's ship took a direct hit during this maneuver, and he barely made it to an escape pod before his vessel broke apart, and he was picked up by a Vraxian cruiser whose captain welcomed him aboard without ceremony. The sun loomed ahead, growing larger and more terrible as they approached, and the heat began affecting ship systems even with shields at maximum. Admiral Hayes checked his calculations and determined they needed to get the entity within 2 million kilometers of the sun's surface for the plan to work, but their ships could not survive much closer than 5 million kilometers. Karen was working on a solution which involved using the last 3 Prometheus devices they had been holding in reserve, and if they could create a gravity well between the fleet and the sun, they might be able to slingshot the entity past them and into the corona. Peter checked her math and said it would work, but the timing would be incredibly precise, and someone would need to stay behind to manually trigger the devices. Admiral Hayes asked for volunteers, and every remaining captain responded immediately. But he chose Captain Blake's second officer, Lieutenant Commander Frank Morrison, who had the best record for precision navigation. Frank accepted the assignment without hesitation and transferred to a small shuttle that would carry the Prometheus devices and himself on a one-way trip. The fleet reached the 5 million kilometer mark and began decelerating while the entity continued at full speed toward them. Frank launched his shuttle and accelerated toward the sun, positioning himself between the entity and the star, and he activated the 3 devices in a triangular formation that would create the gravitational slingshot. Eric fed him targeting data and timing sequences from the horizon, and Frank made micro-adjustments to keep everything aligned. The entity was closing fast, and Frank reported he could see it clearly now, which meant he was far too close for safety, but he held position and waited for the exact right moment. Admiral Hayes gave the final command, and Frank triggered the Prometheus devices, and the 3 gravity wells formed and merged, creating a massive distortion in space-time. The entity hit this distortion at full speed, and its momentum carried it past the point where it could escape, and suddenly it was falling toward the sun, dragged by gravity far stronger than anything it had encountered. Frank's shuttle was caught in the same pull, and everyone heard him say goodbye before his transmission cut off, and his shuttle was consumed by the sun's outer layers. The fleet watched as the entity tried to phase away, but the sun's gravity affected all dimensions simultaneously, and there was nowhere it could escape to. The entity began to break apart as radiation and gravity tore at its structure, and it thrashed like a living thing in agony before finally disappearing into the nuclear furnace of the sun. Karen's instruments showed the dimensional signature dispersing and fragmenting until there was nothing left that registered as the entity they had been fighting. The fleet held position for hours, making sure it was truly gone, and Karen ran every scan she could think of and found no trace of the entity anywhere in the system. Peter confirmed that the sun's fusion reactions had consumed everything, including the exotic matter that had allowed the entity to exist across dimensions. Admiral Hayes allowed himself to breathe for what felt like the first time in days, and he opened a channel to Earth reporting that the entity was destroyed. President Turner received the news in a bunker deep under Geneva, surrounded by Earth's government, and for a moment nobody spoke, because they had all expected to die, and survival felt surreal. The fleet began the long journey back to Earth, and they counted their losses, which were heavy, with 42 ships destroyed, and thousands of crew members killed, including Captain Blake and Captain Miller, and Lieutenant Commander Morrison, and so many others whose names would be remembered. Linda's destroyer barely made it back, with engines failing and life support running on emergency reserves. Dr. Colonel contacted Admiral Hayes and said that she would be returning to Council space to report what had happened and to testify that humanity had saved civilizations that had rejected them. Other independent ships agreed to spread the word about what humanity had accomplished, and Daniel thanked them, knowing that words might not change anything, but hoping they would. On Earth, celebrations were muted because too many people had died, and because everyone understood they had been lucky that Nathan's desperate plan worked. Helen Martinez compiled a complete report of everything that had happened, and President Turner decided it would be broadcast on every frequency humanity could access, so the entire galaxy would know the truth. The broadcast went out 3 days after the battle, and it included footage of the entity and the fight and the sacrifice of human and alien crews who had stood together against extinction. President Turner spoke directly to the Council, and his words were not angry or accusatory, but simply factual, stating what had occurred and how humanity had been forced to act alone because those who claimed superiority had been paralyzed by politics. He ended by saying that humanity remained confined to its system by Council decree, but that they would continue to explore and grow and defend themselves and anyone else who needed help, regardless of what any authority declared. It was a statement of independence that made clear humanity would not be asking for permission anymore. The Council's response took weeks, and when it came, it was predictably bureaucratic, acknowledging that an incident had occurred and thanking all parties involved without admitting any failure on their part. Several Council species sent private communications to Earth offering trade and technology sharing, but these were clearly motivated by fear of what humanity might do, rather than respect or friendship. Daniel was appointed as Earth's new ambassador with a mandate to establish relationships outside traditional Council channels, and he accepted, knowing it would be difficult work, but also necessary. Amy joined him as cultural liaison, and Kyle became head of security for Earth's expanding diplomatic corps, and together they began building networks with species who valued results over protocol. Karen and Peter and Eric continued their research and published papers about the entity and dimensional physics, and their work was quietly downloaded by scientists across the galaxy, even if official institutions refused to acknowledge it. Nathan received funding to continue developing weapons and defenses based on what they had learned, because everyone understood the entity might not be unique. Linda was promoted and given command of a new destroyer, and she trained her crew with lessons learned from the battle, emphasizing adaptability and quick thinking over rigid doctrine. Admiral Hayes remained in command of Earth's defense fleet, which was being expanded and modernized using both human innovation and technology traded from grateful survivors. Months passed, and Earth began receiving visitors who came not through official channels, but as individuals seeking to learn from humanity or offer their own knowledge. Some were scientists curious about human approaches to problems, and others were military officers who wanted to understand tactics that had defeated something the Council could not. A network emerged of independent thinkers and pragmatists from dozens of species who were tired of Council bureaucracy and interested in practical cooperation. This network had no official name or structure, but it represented something new in galactic politics, which was voluntary association, based on mutual benefit rather than ancient hierarchies. Helen noticed that several Council species were experiencing internal debates about whether their governments had failed their people by refusing to act during the crisis. Some younger members of these species were openly questioning why they should respect leaders who had valued pride over survival, and there were rumors of political changes coming. President Turner received a private communication from a faction within the Zarathi government, saying they intended to push for Council reforms and asking if humanity would support them. He consulted with his advisors and decided that Earth would remain neutral in internal Council politics, but would welcome any species that chose to work with humanity on equal terms. The Council itself was fragmenting as member species realized that the old order had nearly gotten everyone killed, and that change was necessary whether the leadership wanted it or not. Some species withdrew from the council entirely while others demanded restructuring, and a few traditional powers tried to maintain control, but their authority was weakening. Dr. Kernel returned to council space and testified about the battle and about humanity's role in saving billions of lives, and her testimony could not be ignored because she was respected and had witnesses from multiple species. The council was forced to acknowledge that humanity had acted decisively when they had failed, and this acknowledgement, even if grudging, represented a shift. Earth was not invited to rejoin the council, and President Turner made